Mariana had barely touched the glass of sparkling water in front of her when her father raised his voice above the quiet conversations filling the rehearsal dinner. "This," Harold Brooks said with an easy smile as he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, "is our son, Ethan, the one who finally made us proud." Polite applause circled the table. Then his hand drifted toward Mariana without even looking at her. "And this is our other child." A few guests turned politely. "She works night shifts at a motel." Laughter, small, uncomfortable, uncertain, rippled through the room. Before Mariana could even force a smile, her mother leaned forward. "We stopped believing in her years ago," Diane said with a smirk. "Some people just never amount to much." The bride's relatives exchanged awkward glances. One woman lowered her eyes. Another offered Mariana a sympathetic smile that somehow felt worse than the insult itself. Ethan looked down at his wine glass. He didn't say a single word. Mariana had heard versions of that introduction for more than a decade, but never in front of strangers. Never at a table where every eye was now measuring her against the successful brother seated only a few chairs away. She wrapped both hands around her glass, willing herself not to react. If she stood up and left, her parents would call her dramatic. If she defended herself, they'd accuse her of ruining Ethan's evening. So she did what she'd learned to do years ago. She stayed quiet. The rehearsal dinner had been held in a restored historic hotel overlooking the river, the kind of place with polished wood floors, crystal chandeliers, and waitstaff who somehow appeared before anyone realized they needed something. The bride's family clearly came from money. Harold had spent most of the evening making sure everyone knew it. He praised Ethan's promotion, mentioned his salary, talked about the house Ethan and his fiancée had just purchased. Whenever the conversation drifted toward Mariana, it somehow circled back to disappointment. "She was always different," Harold said with another chuckle. Diane nodded. "We kept hoping she'd eventually figure life out." Mariana stared at the folded linen napkin on her lap. Neither of them mentioned that she had worked every Christmas for 6 years, so coworkers with children could stay home. Neither mentioned that she had turned down better-paying jobs because the overnight schedule allowed her to care for her grandmother during the day while she was ill. They never mentioned sacrifices, only job titles. Across the table, the bride's grandfather had remained unusually quiet since the introductions. He looked to be in his late 70s, dressed simply despite the obvious respect everyone showed him. Until now, he had spoken only when someone asked him a direct question. Suddenly, he stopped listening to anyone else. His eyes remained fixed on Mariana. Not casually, intently. His expression shifted from polite curiosity to something much deeper. Recognition. Slowly, he leaned forward. The conversations around the table continued, but his attention never left her face. "Excuse me," he said softly. The people nearest him stopped talking. He looked directly into Mariana's eyes. "Hold on." She looked back, puzzled. "Are you—" He swallowed. "Are you Mariana Brooks?" She blinked. "Yes." For a long second, he didn't move. The color drained from his face. His lips parted as though he wanted to say something, but no words came. Even Harold noticed. "What is it?" he asked, with an uneasy laugh. The elderly man barely seemed to hear him. He continued staring at Mariana as though a memory decades old had suddenly come rushing back. Finally, almost in a whisper, he said, "This can't be possible." The entire table fell silent. Harold's confident smile disappeared. For the first time that evening, he looked worried. The silence lingered just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable before someone at the far end of the table forced a laugh. "I'm sure you've met before," one of the bride's uncles said, trying to lighten the mood. The grandfather didn't answer. Instead, he gave Mariana one last searching look before quietly sitting back in his chair. Dinner service resumed. Conversations slowly restarted. Silverware clinked against china. The musicians in the corner resumed playing soft jazz, but every few minutes, Mariana caught the elderly man looking at her again. Not out of curiosity, out of certainty. She kept asking herself the same question. "Do I know him?" His face felt strangely familiar, but she couldn't place it. Maybe he'd stayed at the motel. Maybe she'd checked him in years ago. Working overnight shifts meant she met hundreds of travelers every month. Most became blurred memories by sunrise. Across the table, Harold acted as though nothing unusual had happened. "So," he said to the bride's parents, "Ethan has always been our dependable one." Diane smiled proudly. He knew what success looked like. Mariana quietly reached for her water. She no longer expected them to stop comparing their children. She only wished they would wait until she wasn't sitting beside them. A few minutes later, guests were invited to step onto the terrace while the staff prepared the next course. The evening air was cool. String lights stretched across the courtyard, reflecting off the river below. Mariana slipped outside, hoping for a few minutes away from the dinner table. She had barely reached the railing when she heard careful footsteps behind her. "Miss Brooks?" She turned. The bride's grandfather stood several feet away. His expression was gentle now. "Would you mind answering a few questions?" "Of course." He hesitated, almost as though he was afraid of the answer. "Did you ever work Christmas Eve at an older roadside motel outside Cedar Ridge?" Mariana frowned. "Yes." His breathing noticeably slowed. "Were you working the overnight desk?" "I was." He nodded slowly. "And, several years ago, did an elderly guest collapse in the lobby?" Mariana stared at him. Pieces of an old memory began drifting back. "There was someone," she said quietly. "I remember he looked exhausted when he walked in." She studied the man's face more carefully. "You," he didn't interrupt. "You were traveling alone." His eyes filled with emotion. "Yes." The memory returned in fragments. A freezing December night. A nearly empty motel. Snow piling against the front windows. An elderly guest had entered carrying an old leather briefcase. He'd insisted on checking in, despite looking pale and unsteady. Most people would have assumed he was simply tired after driving all day. But something hadn't felt right. His hands had been trembling. His speech had become uneven halfway through signing the registration card. Then he'd collapsed. "I called 911 immediately," Mariana said, almost to herself. "You kept trying to tell me not to let anyone take your briefcase." The grandfather gave a slow nod. "You remembered. I stayed until the ambulance arrived." She looked confused. "I called the emergency contact inside your wallet." "You did." "I waited with your belongings until your family came." She paused. "I never even learned what happened afterward." The old man's eyes glistened. "You stayed." Mariana gave a puzzled smile. "I was working." "No." He shook his head. "You stayed because everyone else walked away." Before Mariana could ask what he meant, the banquet coordinator stepped onto the terrace. "There you are," she said cheerfully. "They're about to begin the family toasts." The grandfather looked toward the ballroom. Then back at Mariana. There were clearly things he wanted to say. Instead, he simply smiled. "We'll talk again." As they walked back inside together, Mariana noticed something she hadn't seen all evening. Her father was watching them. Not with annoyance. Not with irritation. With unmistakable anxiety. Harold quickly looked away the moment their eyes met. Diane whispered something to him. Neither of them smiled anymore. Mariana slowed her pace. One forgotten night. One elderly guest. One brief conversation. Why had that suddenly made her parents look nervous? By the time everyone returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had settled, at least on the surface. Crystal glasses had been refilled. Dinner plates had been cleared. The wedding coordinator tapped her microphone with a warm smile. "If everyone could take their seats, we'll begin the family toasts." The room answered with scattered applause. Mariana slipped quietly back into her chair. Across from her, Harold had regained most of his confidence. Whatever had happened on the terrace, he seemed determined to bury it beneath another polished performance. Ethan stood first. He lifted his glass toward his fiancée. "I've been lucky enough to have parents who taught me the value of hard work," he said. "Everything I've achieved started with them." Harold beamed. Diane reached over and squeezed Ethan's arm. The guests applauded again. Mariana lowered her eyes to her plate. She didn't expect Ethan to mention her. He never had before. When Ethan finished, Harold rose without waiting to be invited. "I'll only take a minute," he said with an easy laugh. He turned toward the bride's family. "Our family has always believed in responsibility." He rested a proud hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Some children embrace it." Then, with a casual shrug, he glanced toward Mariana. "And some—" He smiled as if sharing a harmless joke. "Take a little longer to find their place." A few uncomfortable chuckles echoed through the room. One guest looked down into her wineglass. Another shifted uneasily in his chair. The bride glanced toward Mariana with obvious discomfort. Harold continued, "We've always encouraged both our children." Diane added smoothly, "But you can't force ambition." Mariana said nothing. Years ago, she might have defended herself. Tonight, she simply let the words pass through the silence. Before Harold could continue, another voice interrupted. "May I say something?" Every head turned. The bride's grandfather was already standing. His tone was calm, respectful, but it carried enough authority that the room became quiet almost instantly. The wedding coordinator smiled. "Of course." Harold stepped aside. "I'm sure everyone would love to hear from you." The grandfather nodded politely. "I appreciate that." He adjusted his jacket, then slowly turned. Not toward the bride. Not toward Ethan. Toward Mariana. The entire room followed his gaze. "I've been listening carefully this evening," he began. "I've heard Miss Brooks described several different ways." He paused. A disappointment. Silence. A woman whose parents stopped believing in her. Another pause. And someone whose work is apparently worthy of embarrassment. Harold forced a strained laugh. "Oh, she's just modest. We tease each other in this family." The grandfather didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, he asked one simple question. "Do any of you know who she really is?" Nobody answered. Mariana herself looked confused. The grandfather folded his hands. "Several years ago, I was traveling alone during a severe winter storm." His voice remained steady. "I checked into a small roadside motel after midnight." He looked directly at Mariana. "I was suffering a medical emergency." Guests leaned forward in their chairs. The lobby was nearly empty. He continued quietly. "People walked past me." His eyes swept across the room. Some assumed I was exhausted. Others didn't want to become involved. Then he smiled faintly. One young woman refused to ignore what she saw. Mariana felt every eye in the room shift toward her. "She called for an ambulance before I lost consciousness. She stayed beside me. She contacted my family. And despite my repeated instructions to leave, she protected something I had with me, until my family arrived." He stopped there. He never explained what that something was. The unanswered detail settled heavily over the room. The bride slowly looked toward her grandfather. "You've never told us this story." "No." "Why not?" He looked back at Mariana. "Because I never knew her full name." His voice softened. "I spent years trying to find the woman who saved my life. No one moved. No one even reached for their glasses." The bride stared at Mariana with growing disbelief. "So that was her?" "Yes." Across the table, Harold's face tightened. The easy confidence he had worn all evening disappeared. Diane's fingers slowly loosened around her wineglass. Ethan looked from his parents to Mariana without saying a word. The room no longer saw a motel employee. It saw someone none of them had expected. Without another word, the grandfather reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He carefully unfolded a small cloth handkerchief. Inside it rested a faded plastic employee name badge. The edges were scratched. The photograph had nearly faded away, but the name was still visible. Mariana Brooks. He gently placed it in the center of the table. Mariana's breath caught. "I lost that." The grandfather looked at her with quiet gratitude. "You lost it the night you saved my life." The old employee badge lay in the center of the table. No one reached for it. No one spoke. Even the waitstaff seemed to sense something extraordinary was unfolding and quietly stepped back from the room. Mariana stared at the faded plastic card. The corners were worn. The clip had been bent years ago. There was no doubt. It was hers. She slowly looked up. "I thought it disappeared after the ambulance left." The grandfather nodded. It did. He carefully picked up the badge. When my family arrived at the hospital, they found it in my coat pocket. Mariana frowned. I don't remember putting it there. You didn't. A faint smile crossed his face. I did. He looked around the room before continuing. At the time, I knew I might not survive. His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. I wanted to remember the only person who refused to abandon me. The bride quietly reached for his hand. He gave it a reassuring squeeze before turning back to the guests. Many people believe my family business survived because of good lawyers. He slowly shook his head. It didn't. He looked directly at Mariana. It survived because of her. A murmur spread through the ballroom. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. What exactly do you mean? One of the bride's uncles asked. The grandfather took a slow breath. The briefcase Miss Brooks protected that night contained original financial records. He paused. They documented years of theft inside our company. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. They weren't copies. They were the only originals. If they had disappeared before my family arrived, the evidence would have been gone forever. He continued without raising his voice. For months, several senior executives had been stealing company funds through fraudulent contracts. My attorneys were preparing to expose them. I was personally carrying the documents to an emergency board meeting. He glanced toward Mariana. I collapsed before I ever reached it. The room remained completely silent. If that briefcase had been lost, he let the sentence hang for a moment. Those responsible would have destroyed every remaining record. The bride's father slowly whispered, "My God." The grandfather nodded. Our investigators later recovered millions of dollars. Thousands of employees kept their jobs. Our company remained in the hands of the families who built it. He looked at Mariana again. And none of that would have happened if one motel employee had decided someone else's emergency wasn't her problem. Mariana lowered her eyes. I didn't know any of that. I know. You kept trying to offer me money afterward. I did. I couldn't accept it. Several guests turned toward her. Mariana gave a small shrug. You were recovering. It didn't feel right. The grandfather smiled. She also refused interviews. She refused public recognition. My family tried repeatedly to thank her. He looked around the room. We couldn't find her. He lifted the badge again. The motel changed ownership less than a year later. Employment records were destroyed during the transition. Our investigators only had her first name. I kept this badge because it was the only proof she had ever been there. Questions began coming from every direction. You searched all these years? We did. You never forgot? Never. The bride looked across the table toward Harold. I'm confused. Her voice was careful. You introduced Mariana as someone you stopped believing in. She glanced back at her grandfather. But she's the reason your company survived. Another relative spoke before Harold could answer. Did you know any of this? Harold opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked toward Diane. She stared silently at the tablecloth. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck without meeting anyone's eyes. No one came to Harold's rescue. The explanation everyone expected never came. Years of family stories about Mariana being lazy, unsuccessful, and disappointing suddenly sounded painfully hollow. The room had begun the evening believing Harold's version of his daughter. Now they were questioning every word he had ever said. The grandfather slowly rose from his chair once more. His movement alone drew every eye back to him. He looked at Mariana with unmistakable respect. Then he turned toward everyone else. His voice became firm. There is something else everyone here deserves to know. The ballroom was so quiet that the soft hum of the chandeliers seemed louder than the conversations that had filled the room only minutes earlier. The bride's grandfather rested one hand on the back of his chair before speaking again. I've told you how Miss Brooks saved my life. He paused, letting his eyes move around the table. But that is only part of the story. Every guest remained fixed on him. When investigators recovered the documents she protected, they uncovered years of fraud. He spoke plainly, without exaggeration. Millions of dollars were recovered. The executives responsible were prosecuted. Our employees kept their jobs. Our suppliers were paid. Our family company survived. He looked toward Mariana, not because she knew what was inside that briefcase, but because she believed another human being deserved help. Mariana slowly shook her head. I only did what anyone should have done. The grandfather smiled gently. No, he answered without hesitation. You did what very few people actually do. He turned toward the bride. When our family realized how much we owed the unknown woman who had protected those records, we established a charitable foundation in her honor. Several guests looked surprised. The bride nodded. I remember. She wiped a tear from her cheek. The Anonymous Hospitality Initiative. Her grandfather smiled. Every year we recognize hotel and hospitality workers who go beyond their job descriptions to protect vulnerable guests. He looked back at Mariana. The foundation was created because of you. Mariana covered her mouth. You named it after someone you never found? We hoped we would. He reached into his jacket and unfolded a small photograph. It showed the first scholarship ceremony held by the foundation years earlier. Across the top of the banner were the words, "Ordinary kindness changes lives." I always believed, he said quietly, that someday I would thank you in person. The bride stood first. She walked around the table until she reached Mariana. Without saying anything, she wrapped her in a hug. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I believed what I heard tonight. Mariana hugged her back. You didn't know. No. The bride stepped back, tears still in her eyes. But I do now. One by one, other relatives approached. And the same people who had smiled awkwardly during Harold's introduction now thanked Mariana personally. One guest said she hoped her own children would grow up with the same character. Another quietly admitted she had judged Mariana the moment she heard the words, night shift at a motel. I was wrong, she said honestly. Mariana simply nodded. She wasn't interested in making anyone feel guilty. Free was relieved that someone had finally spoken the truth. Across the room, Harold remained seated. His confident posture had disappeared. Several relatives who had spent the evening laughing at his stories now avoided looking at him altogether. One of the bride's uncles finally broke the silence. I have to ask. Harold slowly looked up. Why? Harold frowned. What do you mean? Why introduce your own daughter as a disappointment? No one interrupted. The question hung in the air. Harold searched for an answer. He stopped. Diane looked at him, waiting. He tried again. She never. Again. The sentence died before it reached the end. Because there was nothing left to defend. Years of reducing Mariana to her job had collapsed under a single truthful story. Diane quietly lowered her eyes. For the first time that evening, she offered no sarcastic remark, no excuse, no criticism, only silence. Ethan finally stood. He walked slowly toward his sister. I owe you an apology. Mariana looked at him. I should have stopped them. His voice was unsteady. I heard those comments for years. I told myself they were just jokes. They weren't. Mariana studied him for a long moment. You weren't the one speaking. No. He swallowed. But I was the one saying nothing. She nodded once. Silence has consequences too. He lowered his head. I know. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. There were no raised voices. Only the quiet recognition that some damage cannot be undone by a single apology. The grandfather stepped beside Mariana. There is one final reason I've spent years searching for you. He reached into a folder his assistant had quietly brought from another table. Inside was a formal invitation. Our foundation oversees emergency hospitality grants and training programs across the country. He handed the document to her. We need people who understand that compassion isn't a slogan. It's a decision. He smiled. I would be honored if you would join our board. Mariana stared at the invitation. I've never served on a board. I know. I work the front desk. I know. I don't have executive experience. The grandfather chuckled softly. I already have executives. What I need is integrity." The room answered with gentle applause. Not loud, not forced, earned. After a moment, Mariana accepted the invitation. "I'd be honored." The rehearsal dinner ended differently than anyone had imagined. People no longer gathered around Harold to hear stories about Ethan's accomplishments. Instead, small groups surrounded Mariana, asking about the winter night she had almost forgotten. She answered every question simply, never exaggerating, never trying to make herself the hero. That, somehow, impressed them even more. Harold and Diane left quietly. No one stopped them. No one asked for another story. For the first time, appearances had failed them. Character had not. Months later, Mariana's life looked very different. She still believed in helping strangers. Only now, she was teaching others how to do the same. Through the foundation, she helped create training programs that taught hotel employees how to recognize medical emergencies, protect vulnerable guests, and respond with confidence instead of hesitation. She left the overnight motel desk with gratitude, never ashamed of the work that had introduced her to the moment that changed her life. She stayed in contact with Ethan as he worked to rebuild their relationship, but only through consistent actions rather than promises. As for her parents, she no longer measured herself by their approval. Whether they ever changed was no longer the question that shaped her future. She had finally learned that dignity doesn't come from the people determined to overlook it. It comes from living in a way that speaks for itself. Several months after the wedding, the grandfather invited Mariana to the annual foundation ceremony. As the audience applauded the newest group of hospitality workers being recognized for extraordinary compassion, he walked over and shook her hand. Then, quietly enough that only she could hear, he said, "The people who called you a disappointment only measured success by appearances." He smiled warmly. "The rest of us measured it by the lives you changed."